Thank you for those of you that are coming to stay. Hear me talk about emotion today. It's an honor to be here. Wow, I can't do that, but I can tell you about emotion and how it connects to these experiences that we've heard about this morning from Larry and this amazing shaman. So, really short amount of time, I'm going to share with you a new biologically informed view of emotion. One that challenges most of what science and religion have told us about our everyday human feelings. Good feelings like joy and trust and love and compassion. Bad feelings like fear, shame, hate. What I want to say is that these common feelings come freighted with important biological information that we've never really understood. This new science is a game changer for everything we think we know about human being and becoming, for the complexity and richness of identity, the nature of spirituality, and even the mystery of consciousness. So lots of good information to cover, not very much time. So my approach today will be to start with the key insight that's missing from our scientific story and sort of sketch how retelling our evolutionary story with this piece intact can begin to help us re-envision our humanity accordingly. So cutting straight to the chase of this, the main headline here is that emotion is a sense, an entire sensory system. It's a primeval sensory system as old as life itself, one that delivered the first meaningful qualia to our single-celled ancestors. These first-century experiences were binary evaluations, some proto-form of what we experience as pleasure and pain. So the emotional sense is actually the grandfather of all of the other senses. Its ancient evaluative qualia still inherent in visual aesthetics, resonance, dissonance of sound, and unpleasant and pleasant aromas. But its biological function is self-regulation. In fact, emotion is actually a dual-purpose sensory motor system at its core, also controlling the behavior of organisms, moving it toward that which is good for me and away from that which is bad for me. So this is kind of astonishing scientific point here, because these coupled feelings and behaviors, the emotional sense actually provides the vital functions, animation and guidance that the old vitalists used to attribute with spirit or soul. So it's no surprise that emotion has a lot to do with our sense of spirituality and emotion. So, but the revelation that emotion is a sense ushers a flood of new questions. Are the bio values implied universal, or are they relative to the self that's being regulated? Does self-regulation have anything to do with physical health, placebo and nocebo effects of mind and body? Does self-regulation concern subconscious processes or our prefrontal mindful control over ourself and our behavior? Does self-regulation extend to peak human experiences, to empathic and moral self-development, to the oceanic self-transcendence of contemplative practice? Well, the answers to all of those are yes, 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 and yes, including what seems like contradictions and paradoxes, because there are actually now 3 levels of self-regulatory information encoded in our complex feelings of trust and mistrust, envy and admiration. It's an elegant, beautiful system that's reflected in the triune structure of the brain with basic affect, this good and bad qualia that emerged at the very bottom, and then we see the emergence of the basic emotions, which are we'll talk about them later. And then the complex human emotions, which are blends and shades of these primary universals. And we can also, unfortunately, we don't know about this sense yet because there have been a few mistakes. Our excessively objective, deterministic, reductionistic approaches, our neurocentric and anthropocentric assumptions have been preemptive and mistaken. I'll only mention a few. First of all, the naturalistic fallacy implies that there's no values in nature, and our overzealous mechanistic approach eclipsed vitalism when emotion is actually the vital mechanism that delivers those things, and it is very much connected with our sense of deeper self and soul. But perhaps worst of all, we've been persuaded that emotion is bad stuff. At the very best, it is an evolutionary throwback that is mismatched to the modern world. In terms of mental health, most of the DSM, of the mental and behavioral disorders of the DSM-5 are characterized by dysfunctional over-excesses in pleasure and pain, or disordered senses of self in time and space. Worst of all, emotion is associated with sin and evil. Most of the 7 deadly sins are emotions themselves, and all are manifestations of too much pleasure, too much pain, and emotional dysregulation. But nonetheless, there is evidence of emotional sentience all the way up the evolutionary ladder. You can see it in the triune structure of the brain with Jaak Panksepp, affective neuroscience, says that all vertebrates have primary pleasure and pain, and basic emotions are apparent by the reptilian level. By the time we see mammals, we see evidence of even complex, a lot more joy and complex positive emotions, a lot more cooperation that it drives. We see everything from play and fun to altruistic, self-sacrificing alarm calls. We see morality in play and fair play, usually about finding one's place in the dominance hierarchy. We see empathy, and we even see primate grief. So there's plenty of evidence of emotional sentience, but we don't understand the 2 higher levels of information until we go back to the very beginning and understand the logic encoded in basic pleasure and pain. And this is the most important level because this is where we need to understand the primary evaluative logic that's encoded in pleasure and pain. And this is sort of my key message today. In fact, Neil Thies the other day told us about how Niels Bohr was looking for complementaries in biology that might reflect deeper binary complementaries in nature, the kinds of dance of opposites where computational things can happen. So I want to suggest that pleasure and pain, this level of affect, is at the very bottom of all of this, and when we understand the logic, there's several complementarities that are found in our ground zero experiences of pleasure and pain. So when we strip it to its bare bones, we have digital feelings, pleasure and pain, that are coupled to digital actions, approach and avoid. And this beautiful little system sets the stage for all of learning. So this is actually the unconditioned stimulus in Pavlovian conditioning. So we have the beginnings of the mind, actually. And even in evolutionary terms, there must have been a whole lot of evolutionary pressure on any ability to sense the environment and to perceive evaluations of what's good for me and bad for me. So I'm going to roll it back further than the brain and look at how this hedonic behavior is regulated in the E. coli bacterium, because this is how ancient the system is. So what we have in the cell membrane, and the little sensory organ we'll talk about, it's a receptor, a chemical receptor that provides 3 essential steps, kind of like a thermostat, gives rise to the little loop of mind. The most important thing is that there's an ongoing comparison between the self and the not self environment, which when there is imbalances, there is a signal which we experience as pleasure or pain, which triggers a self-correction, a behavioral correction toward or away from the source of the stimulus. Beautiful little chemical machine. And this model of mind, we're not talking about universal mind here, we're talking about more like the Maturana and Varela 4E model of mind, where the mind is fully embodied, it's embedded inextricably with its environment, it's enacted through a cyclic process, and it's extended to the degree that it can learn and remember and develop. I'm adding, of course, a 5th E because it's actually the emotional evaluation that runs the show, runs the entire show. So this comparison is key to our discussion here because it's the self, not self distinction, the comparison that's made that shows up in our immune system and many, many, many more genetic regulatory functions, but it also implies something deeper, which we'll see. So if we look at did I go the wrong way here? Sorry, I'm a little bit of a spaz on this. Okay, so here is the cellular organ. I won't go into a lot of detail, but it's this beautiful little system to where the outside, it's a transmembrane receptor, the outside heads and the inside tails are you measuring the self, measuring the not self environment, and there's good stuff and bad stuff that comes in real time that triggers the flagellum motor on the little creature to either go forward with a clockwise motion, or it can switch to counterclockwise switch to clockwise motion to do a little tumble away. So it's this beautiful system. It regulates the hedonic behavior, which is approach and avoid, in the E. coli bacterium. And we also see the same chemical signaling systems all through our, they're called the molecules of emotion, actually. All the way up. But this here is the tree of life of these little sensory organs, the signaling receptome. And at the very bottom in the yellow circle is the 7-TM transmembrane receptor. Goes all the way down to the origin of multicellularity. And it's shared by all of us, all the way up the tree. So Luca had this. And what's significant to our discussion is that it responds to peptides, the ancient peptides, and some amino acids that are called the molecules of motion all the way up. But there's also, the story gets interesting here because that receptor also picks up electromagnetic fields, light, and simple ions. And its function is to give us biological clocks. And of course, we have biological clocks at every level, and we hear how the rhythm can instantiate different states of consciousness, obviously, at different levels. So this is key to not only what the stimulus might be from a physical level, but it's also implying that there are some sort of perceptions of time involved here. So what I'm suggesting is that this chemistry that we see running hedonic behavior here actually has a bottom-up physical instantiation, and that the behavior of living systems has some degree of interaction with the physics that are going on through emotion, this essential emotional system. And this would provide the link. We've heard a lot about how emotion is sort of the centerpiece of what links us together in terms of resonance and empathy and all of that. So I'm really talking about the biology and the physics underlying that here. Then also, too, there are some that have suggested that the self might go all the way down to a sentient, self-organizing system, which we have the self-not self comparison, and that there might be this greater self down below that's actually part of this comparison too. And in my model, I like to talk about the mind-body over here in the classic physical realm of our experience, but something deeper, the fundamental capacity to observe, for example. In fact, our little comparison, it really would be just a chemical machine all the way up, and without the fundamental capacity to observe, and that capacity being efficacious somehow in the creative dynamics of the universe. So what I'm saying here is that I love Neil and Manus's model, where it goes down to this idea of a universal monism, which in my little story here would be like the self with capital S, and they have this wonderful mathematics of how there's a symmetry breaking process. Within this, it's a completely unbounded sort of self, a symmetry breaking process where there are local boundaries that are mediated that can then become subjective centers for living systems. And if, in fact, as many suggest, that the observation itself, this observing the environment, this defining the self, not self boundary, and being able to expand it and contract it accordingly with both behavior and thought, might very well be the conditions through which this sort of self-organizing process happens from the bottom up. So there's a lot of speculation there but what it suggests is that the self, not self, that we see showing up later in the immune system might be something much deeper, something more like a soul, something more like with potentials, but that whole thing is embodied here due to sort of a connection between these two things without which life would not exist. So this is really key here, because coming back to the physical realm and what we know now about epigenetics. These chemical systems that I'm describing have everything to do with the body's definition of what it is. They're instrumental in not only regular genetic regulation, but epigenetic, which is, of course, the switching on and off. This is more of a real-time with more Lamarckian kinds of evolution. So the implication here that I find haunting is that the epigenetic regulation uses the same kind of methylation marks that we saw very early on in the E. coli system down here that provided the first sort of long-term memory of what is good for me and bad for me. So the implication is that both sensory motor control and the physical immune system sort of started out as this sort of amorphous unity, and they've gone off to differentiate very much. So the key evolutionary point here is that we have one of the central paradoxes of the logic here, in that positive and negative feelings are actually about self-regulatory distress. Hans Selye originally, well, we all know about distress. Stress has become synonymous with distress. But there were actually two types originally. There was distress and there were eustress. There was a good kind of stress through which we learned about new opportunities and benefits and things like that. And I'm suggesting that obviously this is the positive pole, and then it's been completely left out of our story. But that now we know that positive emotion is, and the chemistry I'm talking about is associated with positive health. You know, you have lots of positive experiences. You have far fewer stress responses. You don't overstress the system. So this is the inroad to physical health. And I think had this connection been made between like Gibson's affordances, what's good and bad out there, what's feeling distressful in here, and the Pavlovian learning, all of those things, if we'd seen all that, we would be so mysterious about the informational component and the logic of emotion here. Now we have another of the paradoxes that puts this in a Darwinian perspective, because ultimately, these two beautiful self-regulatory feelings that work together, negative emotion, the distress signals are about self-preservation. They're about preservation of the body, preservation of form. And so that's Darwinian survival. But we have this whole other dimension that's embodied in the wisdom of the positive emotions about self-development. So, which is adaptation in his model, but we know now that adaptation runs the gamut across all of these other, group selection and evo-devo and ecological niche-built construction. And so we have not yet begun to tap what self-development actually means. And yet, it's encoded in this logic. So what we have here is a fundamental evolutionary duality that's a subjective reflection of the criteria for natural selection. So the implication here is that living systems have been participating in evolution all along, and that this logic unites these yin-yang complementaries, such as the need to preserve the body and the need to develop the mind. And of course, unfortunately, we have used pleasure and pain to give life to the fundamental moral dichotomy of good and evil, which does not exist. These are two right and good self-regulatory attractors and purposes, if you will, that are driving and running that show. So you have also, there's another fundamental self-regulatory complementarity here, where the self, the mind self that's being developed, has both an autonomous and a communitarian identity from the very beginning all the way up. So this is one of the fundamental things about the self that's being regulated that we've really missed out on. But you can see, even using the same little circuitry that the E. coli bacterium uses for its sensory motor system with just a little bit fancier peptides, it can do quorum sensing, which is a way that it can sense a me and a we, how many of its contemporaries are in the environment. Then they can switch into cooperative mode, launching a defense against antibiotics or a virulent attack against another species. So even at this very level, we have a self-regulatory mechanism that's building a mind that has a dual identity. So you can see it in the slime mold, you can see it in the hive behavior of insects. We have some ants there. Then when you get to reptiles, you see the beginnings of cooperation through hierarchy, and the reptiles are the first where we have the first of the basic emotions. And 4 out of the 5 basic emotions are negative. They're painful: sadness, anger, fear, and disgust. And the one good one is joy. Now, there's a reason that there are 4 negative basic emotions. These are the primary universals of what to reduce in the external environment. They're the same for everyone. So you see how these 4 negative emotions start with a lot of fight and flight territoriality, and that they eventually fall into hierarchical kinds of behavior, even at the level of reptiles. Then by the time we get to mammals, we see much more embellishment on joy. We see complex bonding and love and affection, and we see, as I showed you before, all of that other beautiful moral stuff that comes out of this. So one of the really good examples of how both negative and positive emotion have structured social systems within this sort of dual identity paradigm are the famous chimpanzees that are more fighting and hierarchical and driven by the pains, and the bonobos, which are notorious for sharing sexual favors and positive emotions to engender cooperation. Now, they have negative emotion too, but it's only used exactly as it should be to punctuate in the short term to mediate this cooperative kind of structure that's emerging. But we humans have totally missed the boat on the logic of all of these paradoxes, which shows up. I don't even need to say any more about that. But what I think is really important here is that within the self-regulatory sense, and you sort of put it against this idea of emotional intelligence, when you recognize that there's this fundamental need to preserve form that might actually be written into sort of the dynamics of everything, but it's one of our foundational impulses mediated by those pains. And if we do that right, we get self-preservation. And then when we have that around, we have the opportunity to really self-develop, which is where we should be. And the more we develop our mind and our empathic circle of connection to one another, we really do get to what Maslow talked about self-actualization. So there's a kind of a personal experience of it that is about the most expansive experiences we can have. They're punctuated with all of the complex feelings that are associated with spiritual experience. But it's because there might be something even deeper about the actualization of matter and life itself that's wrapped into those feelings. So this is where we should be, but unfortunately we're not. And I found this lovely little stage model, because the wisdom that comes out of the 3 levels of emotion is actually, it pulls together almost every stage model that's out there. But there's one on spiritual development. And if you start with emotion, you're already up at the 4th one, because the emphasis on the 4th stage, it actually vaults over all of the, external authorities and adherence to doctrine, not really thinking for yourself. It vaults straight up to stage 4, 3, no, it's 4 actually, that's taking personal accountability for your life. So that's like, hello, my emotions are here, they're telling me something, I need to respond to them, and it's my responsibility to do so. The next stage 5 is all about integrating paradoxes. And this is, of course, understanding these several sets of logic that are encoded within pleasure and pain and how they play out in our lives and create conflicts between and within the self that are actually explained eloquently within how our feelings inform us. So that's where we are going with this. And I just want to suggest that there's plenty of hope for a brave new humanity where we can kind of go back and really look at what our emotions are telling us about ourself, about our self-regulatory system, and about what it means to be human. And this, ultimately, spirituality is not about good and evil or adherence to any external authority. It's a state of consciousness. It's an expansive integration that balances alignments between all of the wonderful complementarities that we see through this recursive action. And it's all about actualizing soul potentials that might be out there within the universal self, if you will. And it is deeply and blissfully rewarding because it's creative. And I think that's what life's really about. Thank you.